Hey there, welcome to lesson 6 of how to make iPhone apps with no programming experience. And in this lesson, we're going to start module 2, and we're going to build a simplified version of the card game War. So I've got Xcode open here. We're going to start our new Xcode project, and in this lesson, we're also going to build the user interface for our app. And we'll get a chance to work with some auto layout more in depth compared to what we did last time. So I'm just going to click create a new project. Okay, and I'm going to choose single view application. If you don't see these templates, make sure you're looking at the application section under the iOS heading here. So I'm going to select that. I'm going to call this project War, and you want to make sure that your language is set to Swift, device set to iPhone, and core data unchecked. Okay, I'm going to save it on my desktop, and once again make sure source control is unchecked as well. Okay, so we default to our project settings. This is going to be the same at this state. It's the same as our Hello World application that we did last time. It's an empty single view application. We're going to jump straight into our storyboard. So if you aren't familiar with the card game War, what happens is that the deck gets split into two piles, and each player, it's played with two players, each player draws the top card off their deck and then just compares the value, and whoever has the larger value gets the point. And then it repeats like that, drawing the top card off of each other's decks. So our interface is just going to be two cards, or two images representing the two cards with a button. When you click it, it's going to draw the next two cards. So now the first thing you'll notice in this user interface is that it's a big square. So I've gotten some questions already about why is it a square and not a rectangle that represents the iPhone view. Well, you can actually change that down here. You can specify how big your canvas size should be. This default square accommodates all types of layouts, including iPad. So we can even change it to this narrow one. You can see down there that it's the base values for the 3.5 inch, the 4 inch, and the 4.7 inch iPhones in portrait or landscape. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, because if you remember from the last episode when we positioned the label, we were doing it based on relative values, based on constraints with auto layout. So at the end of the day, whatever screen size it's going to be, it's going to follow those constraints to position the elements. But this gives us a good visual representation of what we would see when we run the simulator. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is add something called an image view element onto the view controller. And an image view element basically displays an image. And we're going to be displaying the card images like that. So on the right hand corner, if you don't have this pane open, you can click this button to expand it. Okay. Right here in the bottom right is our library pane, if you remember, and I'm going to filter it for image view. So there it is. Displays a single image or animation described by an array of images. I'm going to click and I'm going to drag that on here. Now it expands kind of to take up the whole space, but I don't need it to do that. I actually know what size it's going to be. So I'm going to click this icon down here for pinning, and I'm going to pin it. I'm going to set the width and the height to 120 and the height to 170. I'm going to click add these two constraints. And now you can see from here that there are two constraints for this image view. So when it gets displayed, when I run it, it's going to follow these two rules and adjust the height and width for this guy. Right now in our interface builder, I can actually update the element to follow those two constraints. So I can click this image view, I can click this icon right here, resolve auto layout issues, and I can say update frames for the selected view. And now you can see that it follows those two constraints and gets this size. However, there are no rules for positioning it right now. So what I can actually do using auto layout constraints again is I can click that image view and I can go like that, and I can click this and anchor it something like 50 pixels from the left edge. Okay, so I'm going to add that constraint. So again, it's not updated for the view. You can see this dotted outline. That's where it's kind of supposed to be based on the constraints. And once again, I can click this one and say update frames, and it calculates what it should look like based on the constraints I've added. Okay, now if I wanted to vertically center this, I can click that. I can this time go to align and go vertical center in the container, and again add a constraint so you can see it's supposed to be there. And I go like this, update frames, so it actually sits there. And right now if I run the simulator, we won't see anything because the image view actually has no image associated to it, so it's going to be transparent. We're going to go over here to the attributes tab for the image view, and making sure our image view is selected, I'm going to change the background. So if you click this icon right here, you're going to get a color picker. If you click this right here, you're going to be able to select some from default colors. So I'm going to select the color picker. I'm just going to give it a color so that I can see it, so I can see how it's positioned. So I'm going to run the app at this point just to see how it's positioned. Okay, so there it is. It's 50 off the side. It's vertically aligned, vertically centered, and the height and the width is what I specified it to be. Now if I rotate the iPhone, you can see that it follows the same constraints, right? It's vertically aligned and it's 50 off the edge. Now before we move any further, auto layout and constraints can be frustrating, especially if you're doing it for the first time. Trying to get things positioned based on these rules is not immediately intuitive, but once you do it, you get familiar with it, you do it a bunch of times, it becomes more natural and you know kind of what to avoid and stuff like that. So I'd really recommend that you follow along and just experiment, try things out and lay things out on your screen, add constraints and run it on the simulator, and then see how the constraints affect how it's laid out. So let's say you wanted to edit your constraints. This is what not to do. So don't click your element and then go here and then try to edit your constraints, because these menus down here are just for adding new constraints. What you'll end up doing is having two constraints trying to specify the same thing. Instead, you really want to be looking at this document outline and selecting the constraint that you want to change, and then on the right hand side here you can see that you can edit the values. Okay, so that's how you want to edit your constraints, by selecting it here and then editing it in the inspector pane over here in this tab, this attributes tab. Okay, so now we're going to add a second image view, and it's a good practice to label your elements here. So I can highlight it on the document outline, press enter, and I can just say, first card image, name it like that, because our constraints are going to be, if you have a whole ton of constraints, it's going to be based on the name as well. You can see here, because I changed the name after the fact, that the constraint was created for image view. So if I had changed the name first and then added the constraints, it actually would have reflected the name. Okay. Okay, it doesn't seem to be updating, but we'll do it for the second image view. I'm going to drag another image view, kind of representing the second card. Okay, I'm just going to plop it down there. And now I want this card to be exactly the same size as this one. There's an easy way to do that. You can select them both by holding down Command and then clicking this guy. Okay, let's click them right here. So actually, let's rename this guy first. Second card image. Okay, I can hold down Command, and then I can select both of them like that. Okay, now I can go down here to pin, and I can add two constraints to make them equal widths and height. Because I have specified a height and width for this guy, this new image view is going to take the constraints to have equal height and width. So I'm going to do that. You can see right away that constraints have been added to the second, well actually it's added here, but let's go update frames for all views in my view controller. And you can see that now this guy is the same height and width as this guy, but it doesn't have any positioning rules, so that's why it's just flying all over the place. So we're going to click our second card image. We're going to add a vertical center and container constraint, and then let's update that so it's vertically centered, and we're going to add a constraint to make it 50 off the right side. Okay, so let's update the frames. So now you can see that they're more of a mirror to each other. And again, I'm going to change the color of this guy so I can actually see it. Now let's run it. So you can see that they're both vertically centered, they're both the same height and width, and they're both 50 from the edges. And if I rotate it, the constraints kind of keep it together like that. Now at this point, if this is not what you see and this is not how your app behaves, stop the simulator, and what you can do is you can actually delete your constraints. So for example, if something's not working out as you're expecting, I would recommend just delete your constraints and try again. Sometimes it can be a little finicky like that, and it takes a little bit of practice. Or what you could do is you can select your element, you can go here to resolve auto layout, and you can go clear constraints like that to wipe out all the constraints for that element. There's one thing that I want to change though. In the landscape view, the cards are very far apart and they're basically stuck on the edges of the left and right side, and with a large white gap in the center. Instead, what I want is I want them kind of closer together in this sort of alignment. So what you can do is you can click this guy and then hold down Command and click this guy to highlight them both. And then you can go up here to the editor menu and you can say pin horizontal spacing. And what that does is it adds a constraint that says they must always be this far apart. So right here it's set to, if I select this one, horizontal spacing is what we just added, is 28. So I'm going to run it now and see how it looks. Okay, so it doesn't look quite as what we expected, and you'll also notice down here in our Xcode, in our debug area, it says unable to simultaneously satisfy constraints. Probably one of the constraints in the following list is one you don't want. And let's take a look at why we're getting this error message and why we're getting this behavior. So we added a new constraint to say that it should always be 28 pixels together side by side, and that they should be the same width, and that they should be 50 pixels from the edges, right? But there's one constraint that is conflicting with all of this right now. We have this constraint here that specifies that the width should be equal to 120. Well, the width actually cannot be equal to 120 if we want it to be 50 from the edges and we want it to be 28 pixels apart side by side. It can't simultaneously satisfy all of those conditions together. So at this point, it's just didn't follow the constraint of the width 120. Instead, it followed the constraint of 50 from the edges and the 28 from the center. So in this one, it can. So what we want to do actually is instead I'm going to put these two cards in another container, and I'm going to horizontally center that container. So I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to stop the app. I'm going to go down here. I'm going to choose a view, a UI view. I'm going to type in a UI view, and it just represents a container or a view. So this view can have subviews, and it can contain other views. Okay. So I just dragged it onto the screen like this. And I'm actually going to select both of these guys, and I'm going to just put it into the view. You can see that now in my hierarchy that my two card image views are inside this new view that I added. I'm going to give this guy a name. I'm just going to say, I'm just going to call this card container view. And so for this card container view, I'm going to give it a color so I can see it as well, so it's not invisible. Let's give it a nice calming blue. And for this guy, I'm going to give it a height and width constraint. I'm going to say that the width should be, if the cards are 120 and there are two of them, that's 240. And then there's a margin in between them, say 280, and the height, the cards are 170. I don't need it larger than 170. I'm going to put 170. I'm going to add these two constraints. Okay, so let's update the frames and see how everything looks. Okay, so my container view took on the height and width. I actually want to align it. I want to add vertical center and horizontal center so that my container is in the middle. So let's update the frames again. So there it is. But what happened when we added the two card image views into it is that it lost all their constraints. This one still kept the height and width because this constraint is to do with this card image. But whenever you do any alignment or positioning type of constraints, those constraints are kind of at a higher global level. So all of those are lost. So we basically have our two card image views inside of our container view, but they're not aligned or positioned in any way. So we have to add new constraints to those card image views relative to the new container view that they're in now. Okay, so that might be confusing, but let me add the constraints and you'll see. So for the first card image view, okay, so let's pin it to the left and to the top, 0 margin each. I'm going to add these two constraints. Okay, and for the second card view, I'm going to pin it to the top and to the right, but 0. So now it's kind of aligned to the top and the right with 0 margin. Okay, so let's update all of our frames. The other thing that was lost was that the second card image should be the same height and width as the first card image. So I'm going to select them both by holding down Command and clicking both of them in the document outline. And then I'm going to go here. Actually, I'm going to go to Pin. And I'm going to select equal width and height and add that. And then I'm going to update all our frames again. There we go. So now our second card image view is equal in height and width to the first one, and they both have positioning constraints aligning them to the top left and top right of the card container view with 0 margin. Okay, so now let's run it and see what we get. Okay, so that looks good. And that looks perfect as well. Okay, I'm going to stop it. And for my card container view, I'm going to change it back to a transparent background. So I mainly wanted a colored background to be able to see where it was. I'm going to add a button. So down here I'm searching for button, and this button element is going to allow me to basically create something that the user can tap to trigger something. So here in the document outline, I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it the play round button, as in play around. And I'm just going to double click this guy and change the text to play round. Now in terms of alignment, I can, let's say I can pin it to, well, first of all, I want to horizontally align it. So I'm going to click alignment and click horizontal center in the container and add this constraint. Okay, so I'm going to update the frames. So now it's horizontally centered, but I need to add some sort of vertical alignment or some sort of vertical constraint. And I'm going to anchor it to the bottom of the screen, but at, let's say, 30. Let's see how that looks. So it's going to live 30 pixels from, well, actually, it took 30 pixels from here. So let me see if I can, I wanted 30 pixels from down here. Let me see if I can move it down here. I'm going to delete the constraint that it had. So I'm just going to go here and click clear constraints. So make sure that when you do clear constraints, you're doing it for the selected view and not for all views in the view controller, because that will, you're going to have to start all over if you do that. So I'm going to clear constraints for this selected view. Okay, and then I'm going to try it again. I'm going to select this. I'm going to select that margin, make it a fixed margin of 30, and I'm going to click add constraint. Okay, so now it's, and I added it to down here, and you can see that the dotted line is over here, right? So it, when I cleared constraints, I also cleared the horizontal alignment one. So I'm going to add a horizontal center for the button. Okay, now I can update frames on this guy, and there you go. So I'm going to run it. Now you can see the buttons down here in the portrait view, and when I go to the horizontal view, the button is also 30 from the bottom. Now it looks decent in the landscape view, but in the portrait view, I'd rather have it, vertically centered from this space to this space right here. So we're going to achieve that kind of the same way that we achieved this right here. I'm going to search for a view. Actually, let's do UI view. Same thing, but it just filters it a little better. If you just typed in view, you would have had to scroll all the way to the bottom to find this little guy. So if you type in UI view, it just narrows the search down a little bit more. So I'm just going to add this guy right here. And I am going to basically want it like this. Okay, I'm going to give it a color right now so I can see it. So in this guy, I am going to add some constraints. So I'm going to add all 4 constraints. And I'm going to put it to 0, 0, 0. And you might wonder, if I put it to 0 up here, wouldn't that make this view stick all the way to the top because it has 0 margin? But if you notice this text here, it says spacing to the nearest neighbor. And the nearest neighbor to this view is this card container view, which contains these cards. So I'm going to add these 4 constraints. And then I'm going to update frames. And you notice there's a margin Here's a left and right margin here. If I wanted to stick completely to the edges, when I added those constraints, I should have unchecked constraint to margins, but that's okay. Okay, so now I'm going to put the button into this container. So I can do so here even in the document outline. Again, I forgot to name this guy. I'm going to call it my play button container. And I'm going to drag my play button so that it sits right in there. So you can see it's indented, meaning that the button is inside the play button container. And when I do that, all of the constraints, the layout constraints or the positioning constraints for my button are gone. So I need to add them again. So I'm going to click my play button. I'm going to go here. I'm going to say horizontal center and vertical center in the container. I'm going to add these two constraints. And now it has constraints that is going to vertically position it, vertically center and horizontally center it inside my new container. And now I'm just going to change the color of this container back to white or transparent. And then I'm going to run it. Okay, so now you can see in the portrait view, the button looks better. It's positioned more properly. And even in the landscape view, it's still positioned well. Okay, and the last thing we want to do is actually add an image view for the background, because I'm going to have a background for the entire view. So I'm going to search for image view again. Just going to drag this guy and going to put it there. Let's go like that. And we're going to have to add constraints for this guy. I'm going to anchor it to all of the edges with 0 margin. And I want to uncheck constraint to margins because I don't want it to, I don't want any margin. I basically want it to stick to the outer edges of the screen. I'm going to add these 4 constraints. And I'm going to add a background color so that we can see it, just to make sure it's positioned correctly. And then I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call it background image view. Okay, so let's run it and see if it's actually stuck to the edges. So it is. The good news is that it's stuck to all 4 edges, so it's going to be like a full background to the edges. Unfortunately, it's over top everything. It's covering everything. And there's a very easy way we can adjust that. So let me stop that. In the document outline, we simply have to move the position of this background image farther back, because let's just do that. Because if you can see, the background image currently is covering these 2 guys. So I'm just going to move this up here. Okay, so it's behind these 2 guys, and now it's like that. So just like that, you've created a user interface that conforms to both orientations beautifully. And that's why auto layout is so powerful, especially with the different screen resolutions coming out. If it's your first time working with auto layout, it can be pretty frustrating, and you may be adding and removing constraints and trying to get your UI elements positioned correctly and looking correct in both orientations. However, once you get the hang of it, once you've done it a few times and you're familiar with how the constraints work and how they work in conjunction with each other, you won't have that pain anymore, and you'll be able to harness the power and create really adaptive layouts for any sort of screen size. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you how you can expose these elements to the view controller so that the view controller can manage them. Because if you remember from the MVC pattern, the view controller manages this view.